In this video, I talk about the benefits of using water brushes, how to use them, and I do 2 demo watercolor paintings with them. I compare 2 different brands of water brushes, sketchbooks, and watercolor sets. In the description, there are timestamps to each section, and there are links to all the art supplies I use to make these paintings. I have 2 sets here. One's from Pentel, and the other is from Arteza. Here's the Arteza set. There's a button right here that you push. The handle gets filled up with water and the water comes out through the bristles. Then I have this set from Pentel. They're pretty much the same, except there's no button on there. If you look at this close up, you just squeeze the entire handle. It's not like you have to hit a certain spot. And it's the same concept. The water drips out the front here. So the way you fill this up is you unscrew the handle and then you carefully fill it with water. That's gonna make a mess. The easiest way to do this is in a sink, but since I'm at a desk, I'll just get water everywhere. You can see there's some water in the handle. The water level is up to about here in this paintbrush. Oop. Then you just screw the top back on. And if I squeeze this, water comes out through the bristles. The Arteza brushes fill pretty much the same way. You just take off the top and fill that up with water too. I think these might hold a little bit more water. It's not that big of a deal because you can just bring a bottle like this with you and fill them up as needed. Or you can fill them up in like a public bathroom or wherever you can find some water. This one has like a flat bristle brush, and if I squeeze this, water comes out through the bristles. The benefit of water brushes is that the water is in the brush itself. You don't need to bring a water container with you. So that's a big advantage when you're sketching outside. It's a pain to set up some water and you could dump it over onto yourself or onto something in the area and damage it. So these are much more convenient to use. As an example, here's a kit that contains everything you need to do small sketches outside. This is a pencil case from East Hill. It's probably one of my favorite ones. I like the color, and it has a lot of different pockets and things inside. I have 3 Pentel water brushes in here, a micron pen, and a mechanical pencil. Here's another kit from Cotman. This is a nice one for working outside. It's much more compact than this larger tube set. It has a little bit of mixing room here, and I've done a lot of sketches with this. And that's another thing is you can pack a small like pocket sketchbook in here. And here are some of the sketches I've done using these kits. Just like capturing images and looking for ideas for more finished painting. You could do a 2-page spread like this too. That's kind of fun. So all these little quick sketches I've done with these water brushes and the watercolor. I don't really consider these like finished watercolor paintings. I'm working out color schemes and compositions, but they still work as like finished little sketches that are fun to look at. I like this one on the side here. I think I made that into a finished painting. So when I find a composition that I like, I'll turn it into a larger watercolor painting like this one. I have all the water brushes set up. Now it's time for the fun part. We get to try them out. I figure I'll try out the Pentel water brushes first. I sketched out this cityscape using the Uniball 207 Plus ballpoint pens. Now normally I don't recommend using ballpoint pens because they fade in time and you need something waterproof. But these use what Uniball calls super ink. Uniball says the super ink protects against water, fading, and fraud. It's supposed to be permanent and water resistant. And I have used these for watercolor paintings and it doesn't smear. And for the watercolor, I'm going to use this set of 50 watercolors. This is a cheap set that I found on Amazon. It's made by Grabby. They include a swatch sheet and I spent some time swatching out all the colors. It makes sense to swatch them out because in the pan, the color looks a lot darker. So this looks really dark compared to the swatch that I created. This is the Canson XL Mixed Media Sketchbook. It says it's for mixed media, it's 90 pounds. Watercolor paper is usually like 140 pounds, but if you don't go too heavy on the water, it should be fine. And it also helps to work at a slant like this so that you don't get big puddles of water that soak into the paper. That's when you really have buckling and other issues like that. This is a basic sketch box. You can use it as an easel. It fits canvases, but I also use it for sketching in my sketchbook. I've had it for over a year. I got some paint on it, but it still holds up. So the kit includes 4 different water brushes. There's large, medium, and small. And they also included one that's flat. So if you look at it from the side, it's kind of like a regular paintbrush. And it's a little bit wider, so you can probably get more color down with it. I'll probably start with this medium brush. Here's my reference photo that I was working from. And so I'll just start laying in some of the colors. Now these are watercolor pans. They also have tubes of watercolor, but to use these, you have to wet them first. You can take a spray bottle like this and mist it and give it a little mist, but you can also squeeze your water brush out onto the pan and work it around. You do need something to mix your colors on. And this set doesn't really have a mixing area. Like I suppose you could take this out and mix on here, but it's not white. I feel like they should have painted that white, but I don't know why they didn't do that. I have this porcelain palette that I'm going to use. but you could just use a plastic palette or you can even get a disposable palette. So here's like a watercolor palette for tube watercolors and you squeeze the colors out on the side, but there's all this mixing area and there's a plastic section that comes out. So you have this mixing area and this mixing area. So you might want to pick up a plastic palette like this, or you can just use disposable palette paper. There's a link to all these supplies in the description below. Another thing to keep in mind is that when you first get a plastic palette or even a metal one, the watercolor will bead up on it, but it'll eventually break in and that won't happen anymore. I have an entire video about that. There's a link to it in the description below. I figure I'll start with the building, and it's kind of like an orangey brick color, and this burnt umber looks like it would be a good place to start. In order to activate this, you just scrub the bristles into it and it wets the paint. So you can see it makes like this nice brown color. And I might add a little bit of red to it for other sections. You don't have to squeeze it all the time. Like there's enough water in the bristles right now. And then I can take some of that red, and while it's still wet, you could put it in certain areas where you want it and it will spread out to the other areas. I haven't even squeezed this once. There's enough water in the bristles that it works just fine. And I might squeeze the brush a little bit just to get the water to flow. And to make the sides darker, I'll use some of this ultramarine blue, mix it into this palette a little bit, and just touch it in there and let it flow. So I'll just fill in like this front part of the building, and then maybe I'll move on to these trees. When you want to change the color, you just wipe the bristles off on a paper towel. You can also squeeze the handle to force water through the bristles, and that gets them clean. Another option is to use a microfiber towel. These are the Amazon Basics. It seems to have a little bit more texture to it, so it does grab more of the paint off the bristles. When these rags get dirty, you don't want to throw them in your washing machine because watercolor paint is water soluble. You might end up with stains on your clothing, so it's best to wash them out by hand in a sink or in a bucket. For the color of the trees, I figure I'll use this light yellow olive green and maybe a little bit of the phthalo green or the putting green. It helps to have like a warm and cool green in your trees to give them some sort of variety. So I'm just squeezing the handle a little bit to get water into this area. So now that it's wet, I can load up my brush and drop that in there, and it starts to spread a little bit on its own. I can even add water by squeezing the handle a little bit. You see how the edge is like softer? So now I'll take some of the color next to it, which is the putting green, and add that in there. And then you can take like a warm color and add it in there. This is actually the color of the building, and it does help to add warm colors to your green so they look a little bit more natural. Like a super vivid green looks kind of unnatural because it's so bright. This paper is starting to buckle a little bit in this area because I have so much water in there. And that's expected because, you know, this is a sketchbook. The paper is 90 pounds, whereas most watercolor pads are like 140. But when it dries, it does flatten out a little bit. This might sound odd, but I'm going to add some dark purple to the trees and it'll create some shadow areas. So this is the dark purple. I have an entire video about how to mix greens. I show how you can mix light green permanent and how to make greens look more natural. In that video, I discuss how purple is like the opposite of green, and you can use it to mix like a dark gray or even a black. You can also just paint directly in there without wetting it first. That's another tip is once you have a color on a brush, you can sometimes make it go faster by painting in all the other areas that have that same color. So I'm looking for all the other areas that have trees. That way you don't have to clean your brush out as much. I'll put in the rest of the trees and then we'll come back and work on the buildings. Clean out my brush again, try this rag. Cleans it off pretty well. The bristles will get stained, and there's really not much you can do about it, but it doesn't really affect any future paintings. It just gets stained, that's all. I think I'll put in the brick color of all the buildings, and then maybe do the rooftops. So that was the burnt umber, and sometimes I use a little bit of red. Let's switch over to the large brush. It has a pointier tip, which helps me get in between these windows and things. For the rooftop, I'll use raw umber and ultramarine. So this is the raw umber. I'm not cleaning out my brush because it won't have that much of an impact on the color. And this is the ultramarine blue. So it makes like a grayish color. You can have fun painting in the roof by varying the color by adding more ultramarine in some areas and then dipping into the raw umber to make it more brown. So I'll start with the ultramarine over here and add more of the raw umber as I move down. It just makes it more interesting. If you have the same color for the entire shape, it can look a little bit boring. Some of the shingles on these roofs vary, so this one's lighter, and I wiped off the brush. The color that was left on the bristles worked out pretty good. So I'll use that in some other areas where I see that too. This detail brush is good for painting in windows and other fine details. I'll use the ultramarine blue and the raw umber to paint in some of the darker sections. I've got the whole thing filled in, and now I think I'll just go back in and put in some of the details, like some of the darker areas. Watercolor is pretty tough on sketchbooks, and this held up pretty well. It warped a little bit, but I think that'll flatten out if I close it and put some weight on top of it. I like using these sketchbooks for working out ideas, color schemes, and compositions. I think I'll probably turn this into a larger painting. For this demo, I'll try out the Arteza water brushes. I'm also using micron pens with a different sketchbook. This is a different mixed media sketchbook. It has 100 sheets and it's 9 by 12 inches. I sketched out this Cardinal with the micron pens. They have water resistant ink, so you can go over them with watercolor. Here's my reference photo of the bird. I'll be using this set of common watercolors. These are tube watercolors. These are different than watercolor pans because they're still wet. You just squeeze them out on the palette and you don't need to moisten them. They're ready to go. When these do dry out on here, you can use them like pan watercolors. You just apply some water to it and they'll re-wet. I'll start with the Cardinal, and I think I'll wet the paper first. So I'll squeeze this a little bit, see if I can get some water to come out of it. And then I'll mix up some of the colors. I think I'll start with the red. And I'll squeeze the handle a little bit just to get some water on here. See how quickly I can build up a wash. This paint is ready to go. And then for some of the darker areas, I'll use permanent rose color. I think I'll add some ultramarine blue in there to make that darker for the darker part of the bird. So painting wet into wet is one technique, and I'm thinking this brush will allow me to wet this section where the bird is, and then I can wash. So that area is wet. I already had some of the dark color in here. I want to start with like the regular red, and I'll just pick up some more color and throw it in there real quick. Now that's starting to flow into areas I don't want, so I can just dab it with a paper towel. And while it's still wet, I'll put some of the darker color on this side. I'll take a smaller brush and mix up a darker color for the area around its beak. So this is the ultramarine blue with the red. Now the area under the beak has a little bit more warmth to it. So I'll add some of this burnt sienna to it with a little bit more water. I'm squeezing the button to get a little bit more water onto the paper. I'm switching to the smaller brush so I can get in some of the background details. I think I'll start with some of the leaves that are green, and then I'll paint the dark shapes around that. And I'm thinking I can add some of this ultramarine to make it darker, put it in there while it's still wet. For the background, I'm going to try out this purple color. It's ultramarine blue, and I think this is permanent rose. Yes, permanent rose. Try it real quick back here. And if some of that green runs into it, I don't care so much. I'm thinking of putting some burnt sienna in the background just to have some warm sections, and just try that out here. So I wet that area, and I'll go back into it with the darker purple. I'll just let that run down there. I grab a different brush to pick up some of this green, see if I can get these colors to mingle a little bit. Here's the finished sketch. I think watercolor is the most challenging for sketchbooks. This paper held up pretty good. It buckled a little bit. So I use sketchbooks like this just for quick color studies instead of using like expensive watercolor paper. Watercolor is probably the most abusive to sketchbook paper. I mean, this is made for pencil and pen, and it's not advertised as being watercolor paper. So I'm stretching the limits of this paper. Watercolor paper will allow you to put down more pigment, but for color studies like this works fine. You can figure out what colors to use, and then I can work through a series of these and pick up my favorite ones and make a finished painting. When I work outside, I usually just clean the brushes by squeezing the handle until the water flows through it, and you wipe it off in a paper towel. That'll remove most of the paint, and a microfiber cloth might help a little bit more. For more thorough cleaning, you can use brush soap and scrub the bristles a little bit until you work up a lather, and then you can wipe it off. I clean it off pretty well. So you just rinse the soap off, or you can rinse it off in a bucket like this, and that's about all you need to do. Put the cap back on, and you're ready for the next painting session. Cleaning a Pentel water brush is the same thing. You squeeze the handle, and that will get enough water through the bristles that you can clean it. And like I said, for a more thorough cleaning at home, you just squeeze the handle and scrub it in some brush soap. You can also use like dish soap to clean the bristles. I'll rinse it off in the bucket and then dry it with a microfiber cloth. Now the Pentel brushes you can take apart. I don't normally do this, but if you need to clean out the bristles more thoroughly, you can take it apart. So you remove the handle, and then if you press upwards, this piece will come out. The entire assembly will come out. This black part is like a valve, and make note that the tall part is facing upwards. And you can even remove the bristles by pushing up on them. And you can see how that's stained on the end. It's held together at the top here. There's like a plastic piece. And then you could scrub it in the brush soap and clean the entire set of bristles. Then you just put it back together the same way. You want to squeeze this together so all the bristles are inserted into this black piece. And then you can insert that into the clear plastic end. Then you place this black valve-like thing facing the barrel. Then you just screw the handle back on, and you're all set. I couldn't find a way to take apart the Arteza brushes, but I normally don't really go to that extent. The brush soap usually takes care of everything. Arteza water brushes versus Pentel water brushes. I tend to like the Pentel ones better. I think it's a little bit more intuitive to just like squeeze the handle. I do know Arteza has a set that's similar to this too that doesn't have the button. The other thing I noticed too is the caps will seat on the end of the paintbrush pretty well, whereas some of these Arteza ones, they don't snap into place. So you have to sort of like set that aside. And they're also different sizes. So you got to make sure that you have the right size for the brush you're using. The benefit of the Arteza is that it seems like these hold more water, as I mentioned when I was filling these up. And they also have some pretty wide flat brushes like this, which can be handy for putting down larger washes of color. They're both quality water brushes. I think it's a personal preference. They'll both work. It just depends on what you're looking for. Up next, you can watch my video about the Cotman Pocket watercolor set, or my video about how to prevent your watercolors from beading up on a new palette. Thanks for watching.